When people think about death, many of them feel uneasy. That uneasiness has led to centuries of stories, doctrines, and promises about an afterlife, a place where we continue on, where we meet loved ones again, or where justice is finally balanced. But what if that's not true? What if there is no afterlife at all? The first thing that happens when we take this question seriously is a confrontation with our own fragility. We realize we have one finite life, and that realization can be heavy. But it also strips away illusions and lets us ask a deeper question. If this is all we get, what does that mean for how we live now? Many cultures throughout history created ideas of the afterlife because people couldn't accept the finality of death. Ancient Egyptians built elaborate tombs to prepare for eternity. Medieval Europe created terrifying visions of hell and comforting visions of heaven. Even today, millions hold on to the idea of a soul leaving the body and carrying on somewhere else. These beliefs offered emotional security, but they also served social purposes. Promises of paradise or threats of punishment shaped behavior, reinforced authority, and kept communities in line. But when we remove those promises and threats, something interesting happens. Morality doesn't vanish. People don't suddenly lose their sense of right and wrong. In fact, studies consistently show that ethical behavior doesn't depend on religious belief in an afterlife. Crime rates, generosity, empathy, these all exist independent of whether someone expects a reward or punishment after death. So the absence of an afterlife doesn't mean a collapse of meaning or values. It means meaning has to come from within life itself, and that makes responsibility far more personal. Instead of outsourcing morality to cosmic judges, we recognize it as a human project. There's also the psychological dimension. Belief in an afterlife can ease anxiety, but it often creates new fears. Think of the countless people who grew up terrified of eternal punishment, or constantly anxious about whether they've lived up to impossible standards. For them, letting go of the afterlife isn't depressing. It's liberating. There's relief in knowing that death is simply the end, with no hidden strings attached. From a scientific standpoint, the lack of evidence for an afterlife is striking. Neuroscience shows that consciousness is tied to the brain. Damage a part of the brain, and specific aspects of memory, emotion, or identity are lost. This suggests that consciousness doesn't float free. It depends on physical structures. When the brain ceases to function, consciousness ceases as well. That's not a bleak claim. It's a reflection of what the evidence tells us. But perhaps the more interesting part is how humans respond once they accept this. If there's no afterlife, the stakes of this life increase dramatically. Every choice, every relationship, every moment carries more weight because it's not leading to something beyond. It's not a rehearsal, it's the actual performance. Some people think this view leads to nihilism, but in practice it often does the opposite. When we understand that we only have one chance, many become more motivated to care for others, to protect the environment, to pursue knowledge, to savor art, to fight for justice. If eternity doesn't await, then the finite becomes precious. Even the way we process grief changes. When someone dies, the idea of an afterlife can feel comforting, but it can also make it harder to confront reality. Accepting death as final doesn't erase the pain, but it can make the goodbye more honest. We can honor a person for the real impact they had here, not for imagined futures. Their influence continues in memory, in the ripples of their actions, in the way they shape the world. That kind of continuation is tangible. And then there's the question of justice. Many people feel uneasy that the world isn't fair, that good people suffer while corrupt people thrive. Religious traditions often solve this by promising judgment after death. Without that promise, we're left to deal with injustice ourselves. This might feel like a loss, but it's also empowering. If no cosmic judge will right the wrongs, it falls to us. Human justice systems, human compassion, human solidarity, these are the tools we have. And when we realize no higher power will intervene, our urgency to improve the world grows stronger. Another overlooked angle is how belief in an afterlife can actually diminish appreciation for life. If this world is only a temporary stop, then its beauty and fragility can be dismissed. Nature becomes a backdrop, relationships become preparation, and suffering becomes bearable only because something better is coming. Removing the afterlife flips that perspective. This world becomes the only stage. Its beauty isn't a preview, it's the entire show, and that realization can make even the smallest moments shimmer with importance. When children learn about mortality without afterlife stories, their questions are different but not emptier. They may ask, if death is the end, why does life matter? And that's a powerful question, because it opens the door to deeper thinking. Instead of ready-made answers about heavens or hells, they grow into an understanding that life matters because of the connections we make, the kindness we show, the knowledge we create, and the joy we experience. The lack of an afterlife doesn't rob us of meaning. It forces us to build it ourselves. The human brain has always craved certainty. Uncertainty makes us restless, especially about something as big as death. So it's not surprising that so many cultures filled that gap with elaborate stories of what comes after. But when we take those stories away, something else emerges. A clearer picture of how humans can live without leaning on illusions. Think about how societies function. In many places, belief in an afterlife has been used to justify inequality. Kings, priests, or emperors claimed authority because they were supposedly connected to the divine. People accepted suffering in the present because they were promised reward later. In that sense, the afterlife has often acted as a political tool. Remove it, and suddenly the promise of justice shifts from someday to right now. It changes the balance of power. There's also a fascinating link between belief in the afterlife and fear of death. Studies in psychology show that people who are certain of an afterlife still report fear of dying. Not always less, sometimes even more. Because once you believe in eternal consequences, death becomes loaded with anxiety about judgment, sin, or being on the wrong side of history. In contrast, when people see death as the end, fear often softens into acceptance. Not because dying is pleasant, but because it's simple. There's no eternal torture, no cosmic scorecard, just the natural conclusion of a finite process. This perspective can even reshape how we see aging. Instead of clinging to youth because we're afraid of what comes after, we might value every stage of life for what it is. Childhood isn't a test run. Old age isn't wasted time before eternity. Each stage carries its own meaning, because each is part of the only life we'll have. Another overlooked aspect is how the absence of an afterlife influences creativity. Some of history's greatest art, literature, and music has come from people who weren't banking on eternity. They were motivated by the fleeting nature of existence. A painting, a poem, a symphony, all attempts to capture something temporary and make it last. Mortality, not immortality, has fueled much of human culture. There's also the way science itself benefits from rejecting the afterlife idea. If we believe that answers awaited us after death, curiosity might fade. Why push to understand the universe now, if eternal knowledge is promised later? But once we accept that death is the end, the drive to explore, to map reality, to stretch human understanding becomes urgent. Science thrives on the recognition that we must figure things out while we can. Critics sometimes argue that without an afterlife, suffering becomes unbearable. But this misses the point. Suffering is real whether or not eternity exists. The difference is how we respond to it. If we believe suffering is part of a divine plan or a test for the next world, we may tolerate injustice. If we know this life is all there is, then suffering demands solutions here and now. That urgency can drive progress, from medicine to human rights to technology. In fact, much of human advancement has been fueled by people who refuse to wait for salvation. It's also worth thinking about how belief in no afterlife shapes relationships. If you truly think you'll see someone again after death, you might take their presence for granted. But if you know this is the only time you'll ever share, every goodbye is heavier, every hug deeper, every moment more valuable. The fragility of life becomes a reason to love harder, not less. Even on a cosmic scale, the absence of an afterlife reframes our place in the universe. Instead of seeing ourselves as eternal souls in temporary shells, we see ourselves as stardust, matter temporarily arranged into consciousness. That view doesn't make us smaller. If anything, it makes us extraordinary. Out of billions of years of cosmic evolution, here we are. Aware, thinking, able to reflect on our own existence. Not because we're destined for eternity, but because we're part of a brief, remarkable moment in time. Philosophers like Epicurus pointed out long ago that death should not frighten us because when death is here, we are not. And when we are here, death is not. It's a neat way of saying that our fear belongs to a moment we will never actually experience. We won't be around to know what being dead is like. That realization can strip away unnecessary terror and leave behind a kind of peace. The real challenge isn't death itself, it's how to fill the space before it comes. If there's no afterlife, then legacy becomes one of the closest things to immortality we can achieve. Our actions ripple outward. Ideas survive us. Art, discoveries, kindness, all leave traces that outlast the body. Think of Socrates, Darwin, or even everyday teachers and parents whose influence continues long after they're gone. Their immortality isn't in another world, it's in the way they shaped this one. This idea can even shift how we see morality on a practical level. Without an afterlife, there's no cosmic checklist. Goodness has to matter in human terms. That makes morality less about obedience and more about empathy. Why avoid harming others? Not because of hell, but because pain is real here. Why help others? Not for heavenly reward, but because their joy is real here too. It's a morality rooted in compassion, not calculation. And there's something refreshing about honesty. When we stop telling ourselves comforting stories about eternal reunions, we're left with the raw truth. It may feel harsher at first, but in the long run, truth grounds us. It prevents disappointment. It frees us from bargaining with fate. And it teaches us to face life head-on, without crutches. The question, then, isn't whether life has meaning without an afterlife. The question is, what kind of meaning we choose. Is it found in relationships, in knowledge, in beauty, in laughter, in fighting for a cause that may outlive us? All of those are possibilities. None of them require eternity. In fact, they shine brighter precisely because they're temporary. When we think about the possibility of no afterlife, we're really thinking about two things: what death means and what life means. Death, in that case, means finality, but life suddenly means everything. Instead of being a waiting room for eternity, it becomes the main event. And that shift can completely transform how we live day to day. Consider how time feels. When something is unlimited, we tend to waste it. If you believed you had infinite lifetimes, would you push yourself to create, to love, to take risks? Probably not with the same urgency. But when you know time is limited, every hour matters more. Mortality injects life with urgency, and urgency creates meaning. Think of how people who survive a near-death experience often describe it. Colors seem brighter, small pleasures feel richer, and they become more determined to live fully. That intensity doesn't come from the promise of eternity. It comes from knowing time is short. This perspective also alters how we see success and failure. In a world with an afterlife, failure can be brushed aside. The real reward lies elsewhere. But if this life is all there is, then success and failure matter differently. They don't define eternal destiny, but they shape the quality of the one life we get. Failure isn't erased, but it's also not eternal. It's just a part of the finite story. That can make people less paralyzed by fear of mistakes and more willing to experiment, to try, to grow. It also pushes us to rethink forgiveness. Without cosmic judgment, forgiveness is no longer about divine approval. It becomes a human act, an attempt to repair relationships and reduce suffering. That makes it more practical, more grounded. Forgiveness isn't about securing a place in paradise. It's about healing here and now. One of the strongest arguments often made in favor of an afterlife is that people need it for comfort. But comfort is not the same as truth. Believing something because it feels good doesn't make it real. And the danger is that comfort can sometimes become complacency. If people feel they'll meet loved ones again, they might neglect the value of cherishing those loved ones while they're alive. If they believe ultimate justice comes later, they may ignore the need to fight for justice now. In that way, comfort can be a trap. Another overlooked angle is how the absence of an afterlife changes our relationship with the planet. If you think this world is disposable, just a temporary stop on the way to eternity, then environmental destruction seems less urgent. But if this world is the only one we'll ever know, then its forests, oceans, and skies are infinitely more precious. Protecting them isn't just wise policy, it's protecting the very stage on which all human meaning takes place. Without an afterlife, environmental ethics become even stronger. There's also an important psychological point here. The idea of an afterlife often turns death into something we can win or lose. People ask, did they go to heaven? Or, what happens if I fail? That framing makes death competitive, moralized, and stressful. But if there's no afterlife, death simply becomes a fact of biology. We stop worrying about being judged after death and start focusing on living authentically before it. It removes a whole layer of anxiety that never needed to be there in the first place. Even in terms of human unity, the absence of an afterlife can bring us closer together. Many conflicts in history have been fueled by different visions of what happens after death. Heaven versus paradise, reincarnation versus resurrection, salvation through one path versus another. Wars, persecutions, and divisions often grew from those competing claims. Take those claims away and suddenly we're all in the same boat. One life, one planet, shared mortality. That realization has the potential to unite rather than divide. And then there's the question of legacy at a collective level. Civilizations often justified cruelty by appealing to afterlife narratives. Think of the Crusades, or suicide bombers, or colonizers who said they were saving souls. If you remove the afterlife, those justifications collapse. Wars for paradise lose their fuel. The only stakes left are here, in the real world, where consequences are immediate and measurable. That's not just a philosophical shift, it's a political one. There's also the role of honesty with children. Many adults feel uncomfortable telling children the truth about death. They reach for afterlife stories because they seem kinder. But in the long run, honesty can actually build resilience. Children who grow up with the understanding that life is finite often develop a stronger appreciation for the present. They learn to value loved ones more deeply and to approach time with respect. Shielding them with fantasy might delay grief, but it also delays growth. When we look at human progress through history, we see that much of it comes from people who stopped waiting for divine rescue and acted themselves. Medicine wasn't handed down from the heavens. Human beings studied disease, experimented, failed, and tried again. Social change didn't arrive through cosmic justice. It came from movements, revolutions, and persistent struggle. The absence of an afterlife forces us to own that responsibility. No one is coming to fix it for us. And strangely, that can be empowering. Because when you think about it, the belief in no afterlife is not about despair. It's about maturity. It's about recognizing that life is enough, that it doesn't need eternity to matter. It's about taking responsibility for what we do with the time we have. It's about facing reality directly, without escape hatches or detours. And in that clarity, many people find not fear, but freedom. There's something powerful about realizing that life's value doesn't come from what happens after, but from what happens during. That shift changes everything. It changes how we see success, how we love, how we forgive, how we grieve, and how we treat the world around us. Once we drop the idea of eternity, we begin to see time not as something to endure, but as something to treasure. Think of the way music works. A song doesn't need to go on forever to be beautiful. In fact, its beauty often comes from its brevity, the way it rises, lingers for a few minutes, then fades. We don't complain that the song ends. We appreciate it more because it does. Life works in much the same way. It doesn't need to be infinite to matter. It needs to be lived, felt, and shared. Some might say this makes life too small, too fragile. But fragility doesn't diminish value. It enhances it. A glass sculpture isn't less meaningful because it can break. It's more meaningful because it requires care. Life's fragility makes it something worth holding carefully, worth protecting, worth cherishing. If we lived forever, would we ever really appreciate it? Or would we waste centuries the way people waste days now? Mortality gives us perspective. There's also something deeply human about finding meaning without guarantees. Think of explorers setting out without knowing what they'd find, or scientists experimenting without certainty of success, or lovers committing without promises of permanence. So much of human greatness comes from stepping forward without assurances. Life without an afterlife is an extension of that same courage. It's the willingness to face reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. And while it may sound harsh to say that death is the end, there's a softer side to this truth. Death marks the completion of a life, not the erasure of it. Everything a person did, every word, every gesture, every creation, every influence remains woven into the fabric of reality. Their existence mattered because of what they brought into this one world. That legacy is real, and it doesn't require eternity to be profound. One of the most profound consequences of rejecting an afterlife is how it equalizes us. Kings and beggars, geniuses and ordinary workers, saints and criminals, all share the same fate. No one escapes. That might sound grim, but it can also foster humility. It reminds us that no matter our status, we are bound by the same mortality. And if we're bound by the same mortality, maybe we should also be bound by the same compassion. It's also a reminder that justice, if it's to exist, must be made by us. We can't pass the responsibility to invisible judges. If we want fairness, we must build systems that deliver it. If we want kindness, we must practice it ourselves. If we want peace, we must negotiate, compromise, and protect it. The absence of an afterlife doesn't remove morality. It sharpens it. It makes it clear that morality is not about eternal reward or punishment, but about reducing suffering and increasing joy in the only world we know. So what happens when we take seriously the idea that there is no afterlife? At first, it can feel like a door closing, but look closer and you'll see another door opening. It's the door to a life lived with honesty, urgency, and depth. A life where meaning isn't handed down from outside but built from within. A life where we stop waiting for eternity and start paying attention to now. Camus once suggested that in a world without higher meaning, we are free to create meaning ourselves. That's not a burden, it's an opportunity. It means life is not a script written in advance. It's a canvas, and we're holding the brush. Some may find that terrifying, but others will find it exhilarating. In the end, the absence of an afterlife doesn't make life smaller. It makes it sharper. It makes every sunrise, every friendship, every act of kindness, every discovery, every laugh, and every tear infinitely more significant, precisely because they won't last forever. And maybe that's the point. Life doesn't need to be eternal to be meaningful. It only needs to be lived. So the question isn't what comes after death. The question is, what will we do before it?